Thanks for joining us for the second half of today's event for a discussion about our recent report on AI bias and what leading AI companies are doing to confront the issue. For those who haven't had a chance to check out our report, you can find it linked on today's event webpage or at bsa.org/AI. The report is the product of a year-long effort working in partnership with our member companies to develop an AI risk management framework to identify and mitigate the risks of AI bias. The report is built on three key elements. First, it identifies a comprehensive methodology for performing impact assessments to identify the sources and risks of bias throughout a system's lifecycle. Second, it identifies the best practices and technical approaches that companies can use to mitigate the risks of bias that might be identified during the impact assessment process. And finally, it sets forth the key corporate governance safeguards that are necessary for promoting organizational accountability and ensuring that there's robust oversight of AI risk management functions. Our hope is that the framework will be a useful tool for companies that are both developing and using AI systems, and that it'll help inform policy discussions about how to create effective regulatory approaches for promoting responsible AI practices. We have an all-star panel today, so I want to get started quickly and introduce them. First, we're joined by Paula Goldman. Paula is Salesforce's first ever Chief Ethical and Humane Use Officer. In that role, she has led Salesforce's efforts to operationalize their commitments to building ethical technology and ensuring that it's used in a socially beneficial way. Second, we're joined by Dana Rao. Dana is the Executive Vice President and General Counsel at Adobe, where he leads the company's legal and government relations teams. Before embarking on his legal career, Dana studied electrical engineering and AI, so he brings a pretty unique perspective that bridges both the technical and regulatory aspects of the AI bias conversation. Next up is Rich Sauer, who is the Chief Legal Officer and Head of Corporate Affairs at Workday, where he leads the company's compliance and government affairs functions. Prior to joining Workday recently, Rich served in a number of senior posts at Microsoft, where he helped orchestrate the company's approach to responsible and ethical AI. And last but not least, we're joined by Kush Varshney. Kush joins us from IBM Research, where he leads the machine learning group at the Foundations for Trustworthy AI, where, among other things, he's helping design tools and processes to help promote AI fairness. I'd like to start the conversation by talking a little bit about what your companies are doing internally and about the unique opportunities and challenges around the use of AI. So Dana, I know over the last couple of years, you've led an effort to operationalize Adobe's approach to AI ethics. Would you mind talking to us a little bit about that and sort of what that journey looked like and what are some of the key lessons you learned along the way?
Absolutely. And thank you for having me, Christian, and thanks for the panelists. And I hope you guys all jump in whenever I say something that makes no sense to you. But we started this 2 years ago. As Christian mentioned, I'm at Adobe, the general counsel at Adobe. And Adobe has three different major initiatives. And one is Creative Cloud, people know that, Photoshop and everything. And the other is Document Cloud, Acrobat, PDF, everyone knows that. And then the third business is web analytics business, digital marketing. All three use AI, and we were trying to think about how to really enable the people who use our tools in the Creative Cloud's case, the creatives, the best way they can. How can they go out there and make the world's greatest images, videos, illustrations? And as we were giving those tools and using AI to do it, we started to consider the consequences of that and embedding AI in our tool, and what would happen if people were using AI and then our tools all of a sudden would give results that maybe would not value the customer the way Adobe values its customer. And that's how we think about it. And so we started this journey about, is there a way to design AI that is going to be in accordance with our company values, still pushes the boundaries of innovation in a way that we need to do that, both in that creative space, also with Acrobat and text and editing and words, and then also in this web analytics space where we're spending time helping enterprise customers craft offers for different demographics. And So the first thing we had to do, I think probably everyone here on this call had to do, right, is just sort of ask themselves, like, who are we? What do we stand for? We have a set of company values. What does that mean in the terms of AI? And we spent 6 months thinking what those values would be, these principles for us that resonate with us as a company. And everyone's going to be different. Every company is different. I would encourage everyone out there to really reflect on your business model, your goals, who you are, and then make sure that these principles accurately and reflect those, because they're not going to succeed if they don't truly represent who you are. And we have a very specific way we go about business at Adobe, and they needed to reflect that. And the way we did create that is we had 20 people in this committee, every discipline, so marketing and comms and engineering and the AI team and legal and just not for their function, but just from their perspective, because this is a human issue, and we wanted that diversity of professional experience in order to really make sure that we're thinking through. And we also wanted racial diversity and gender diversity and making sure we had all those perspectives in that committee. So they came up with these principles, and once we had those, because we're an engineering company, we spent 6 to 8 months operationalizing them. So we created an AI impact assessment, which I know is also part of the BSA framework. And we think about that as a engineering tool to allow that engineering team to quickly assess what exactly they're doing and how this new AI feature is going to impact consumers and what the problem is they're trying to solve in a short form. And then it goes to our AI review board, which is a much smaller group of people, again, diverse in terms of professional experience and racial and gender. And they review it. And if it's an easy off-ramp, this is really important because we're a product company, we're trying to sell stuff, then we just let it go, right? Because most of the things, much like the EU framework that we do, are low risk. Right there, there's an example we always give. We have AI that helps you choose which font to use based on your experiences using fonts in our products. It's pretty hard to see how that's ever going to have a negative impact on humanity, whether we choose, type New Roman or Helvetica. So that one just goes, and that lets the engineering team get out the door really quickly. On the other hand, if they flag the data sets they're using and the problem, the use case, and it's like, we're going to provide images to users, and in return to search, we have a stock photography business. So if you're typing in lawyer, what does it look like? We ask the questions. We say, hey, did you run this test against a diverse data set? Did you run it against these use cases? And if they haven't, we send it back to them and they have to go back and test it. And if they have a problem, then they need to go diversify that data set or create synthetic data or look at different issues in order to remediate that data. So having that engineering operational system built out, tested, educated the organization, which we're still in the process of. But we've had over 15 different products go through this process now since October when we launched. We can feel good about that and feel good about the next steps. So it's still a ton of work to do in terms of where we go.
Thanks, Dana. Paul, I mentioned earlier that you're Salesforce's Chief Ethical and Humane Use Officer, but as far as I'm aware, you may be the only Chief Ethical and Humane Use Officer. So you have a pretty unique role in that it seems to be sort of both inward facing, looking at sort of how Salesforce is developing its tools and products, but also looking outward. You're trying to create policies and processes to guide your customers' potential uses of Salesforce's products and services. Can you talk about how you approach those roles and sort of how they relate to Salesforce's efforts to deal with challenges like AI bias?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have to say, it was fun to listen to Dana's response. I might actually give a rejoinder that I think you might find some people very passionate about the detrimental effects of fonts like Times New Roman on humanity, but we can discuss that another time. So yes, the role of Chief Ethical and Humane Use Officer has been an incredible ride, and I think we've positioned it very centrally in the company. And essentially what it means is overseeing, as you noted, teams that work on a variety of things. So there's a policy team. And I think you're going to find similarities in terms of process across all of our responses here. But that policy team, we have an internal, we have an ethical use advisory council, which includes frontline employees, it includes executives from across the company, and it includes a number of external experts from a variety of disciplines. And that group has a very extensive process to set policy around how customers use our product. And what I would say is, I can go through that process in a lot of depth, but the central thing is it's about listening. It's about taking these very complex situations or dilemmas that arise and looking at them from multiple angles, multiple perspectives, multiple lived experiences, and coming up with what we think is the best solution. You know, Dana mentioned coming up with principles to guide our work. I think all of us do that, right? And we look at both our values as a company. We look at kind of, you know, the variety of academic and expert literature on various topics. We looked at our values as a company. We realized they weren't specific enough, and that we needed to have more specific set of principles guiding our technology. And we actually surveyed our employees. And in the rank order that they wanted the principles to be, you know, ranked, that's what we have them, like our number one principles around human rights. So that's the big part of the work. The other big part of the work is working directly with product teams. And what I would say is it's not just reviews. We certainly have a review process, especially around AI. But what we're also trying to do is embed a culture of foresight when we're building products. And so we do an exercise called consequence scanning, where we look at a product and we ask, like, you know, what are you trying to accomplish? What are the intended consequences? What might be some of the unintended consequences? And we find that that process creates new ideas for the backlog and new features. So just to give you two examples, one on the policy side and one on the product side as it relates to AI. A little while back, a couple years ago, we were looking at facial recognition on the policy side and looking at the data which said that facial recognition still was sometimes not accurate on people of darker skin, and the pioneering, you know, studies of people like Tanit Gabru and others on that. We actually wrote into our policy a prohibition of using our models for the purpose of facial recognition. So that's in our acceptable use policy. Conversely, on the product side and on the generative side, we have a feature in a lot of our products called sensitive fields, which allows our customers who are building models to exclude what they may see as sensitive variables that could introduce bias from their model. So that may be race, or it may be zip code, which is related with race. And there's like little warning toggles that come up. So that's kind of it, just to give you a sense of the breadth of the work. That's a sense of what we're up to.
Great. Thanks, Paula. Rich, I wanted to sort of refer people to Workday's recent white paper on AI bias issues and sort of your thoughts on sort of where AI regulatory processes should move. I thought it was pretty interesting in the white paper. You referred to the risk of a potential trust gap around AI, and that's sort of what guides Workday's thoughts on sort of potential regulation. Can you talk a little bit about that? What you worry its consequences could be, and what you think industry and governments can be doing to avoid it?
No, happy to, Christian, and thanks for having me today. It's funny you mentioned I was at Microsoft. I've been at Workday now for almost 2 years. When I was at Microsoft, I was sort of working almost full time on these issues, and I used to go to a lot of these sorts of panels. But it's been a couple of years since I've been on a panel like this. And 2 years ago, when I would be on these panels, we were talking about principles. It was all about principles. We need to write our principles, and it turns out if you look at our principles are all, you know, relatively similar and fairly close. But what Paul and Dana have demonstrated, like how far we've come. I mean, but boy, because it is all about, you know, the principles in some ways, as hard as it is to get those on paper, that is still the easiest part of this. The hardest part is implementing it and putting in the governance that you need around it. So kudos to both of them for the incredible work they're doing at Adobe and Salesforce. On your question, I mean, you know, the rallying cry for tech for quite a long time has been, you know, if customers don't trust your tech, they're not going to adopt it. That goes back to certainly as far back as 2013 when Edward Snowden, you know, left the country with 5 laptops full of, you know, NSA data that was at least allegedly at the time attributable to complicity by U.S. tech, and it turned out to be false allegations. And that was all related to privacy and data protection and law enforcement access to data. And it was all about trust, and we all worked really hard to demonstrate our bona fides on trust. That applies, I think, with equal force or maybe even greater force today to this conversation on AI and bias and the issues. And particularly, I think if you look at the climate we're in with the year that we've just been through, the racial and social justice movement, certainly our customers are, if we are developing technology that is potentially going to expose them in issues around bias, they are going to want to be very sure that they can trust what we say, that they can, that we're going to live up to our promises, that they know that we've put it through rigorous testing and rigorous processes to sort of make sure that we've gotten through and done the right thing. And as a vendor and a developer, we have a lot of this is in our control. There's a lot we can do in this regard. I think the BSA framework is an excellent tool for companies to deploy to sort of earn that trust and to win over customers' trust. Principles, governance, all the things that Paula and Dana have talked about are key to sort of winning and maintaining that trust of customers. We do go in that paper, thanks for mentioning it, we go a little bit of a step further than the BSA framework today, where we actually say, hey, not only should we be doing these things as companies and doing all these great practices, we've actually are advocating that we should actually codify this into law, that there should be AI regulation. And the reason for that is pretty simple, which is we think we can do a lot of things to earn our customers' trust, but we think it will be additionally helpful if customers know that, hey, not only is Workday doing these things, but we know that they're doing them because they're required to by law, and they've got a regulator looking over their shoulder. And I was super happy to hear Victoria say today on the panel that that's the BSA supports regulation in this space as well.
Great, yeah. Thanks very much, Rich. And you put a fine point on why we thought it was important to create a framework. There has been a lot of discussion about AI ethics and principles for the last few years, and understandably, there's also a concern out there that a lot of that might just be ethics washing and companies espousing these high-level principles without a real discussion of what they mean in practice. So we looked at the framework as sort of an opportunity to demonstrate sort of how ethics meets engineering and what companies can and should be doing to sort of operationalize those key commitments. Kush, you and I met for the first time several months ago. You were a huge help as we were putting together this framework because these are issues that you've been looking at from an engineering perspective for a long time. One of the realizations that we had pretty early on in putting together the framework is that it's, that the sources of bias are so complicated, and there's so many, and they can rise in so many different ways that it's impossible to just simply eliminate the risk of bias, and that it's something that needs to be sort of continually monitored, right? And so the sort of intuition of our framework is that you really need to take a risk management approach when you're dealing with AI bias. Can you talk to us a little bit about why viewing these issues through the prism of risk management is the right mindset?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, just to repeat, it's a pleasure to be here. I mean, the way to think about it is really, this machine learning development lifecycle, and it has a lot of phases, right? I mean, there's problem specification, there's data understanding, data preparation, there's modeling, evaluation, and then monitoring throughout. And as you said, right, I mean, there's risks of bias in every step. And we really should be managing and mitigating those risks throughout, all throughout, right? So just to give some examples of what is happening in these different phases, right? So in the problem specification phase, we already heard from Dana and Paula, right? The first question to ask is whether we should even be working on a problem using AI. Would it be an instrument of oppression or curtail human rights or these sort of things, right? And Paula already mentioned face recognition as an example where there might be an unacceptable risk. And so Yeah, I mean, exactly in the beginning, are we doing this problem or not? Are we working on it? Is the very beginning of the process. And as we already heard, I mean, involving a panel of diverse voices, especially those with lived experiences of marginalization and so forth, is a great way to work on that step, right? Then we move on to kind of data understanding, and again, I mean, there's potentially many different biases that can happen in the data itself. So social biases, sampling biases, and so forth. So an example of that that all of us are probably somewhat familiar with is the SAT score in college admissions, right? So it's pretty well recognized that there are structural biases because of which that one score doesn't accurately represent the underlying ability of the individual student to succeed in college. There's cultural knowledge embedded in the questions and so forth. So we just need to put in the effort and understand what is the data, where is it coming from, what biases does it already have, and then the next phase being data preparation, right? So the data scientist takes that data, the features and everything, and does something to them to get them ready to be put into a machine learning model. And an example there that one of my colleagues recently uncovered during his analysis of typing research comes from the healthcare domain, right? So many of us have probably heard of this example where insurance companies who offer coordinated preventative care to those who need it, we're seeing some biases against African Americans because African Americans in the U.S. tend to utilize the healthcare system less for the same amount of how sick they are. Right? So that colleague of mine, what he analyzed was if you look at these different healthcare utilizations and lump them all together into one feature, then there's a lot of racial bias. But if you keep these different costs separately, so emergency room visits separate from inpatient, separate from outpatient, and so forth, then you actually don't get that extreme racial bias that you would have otherwise. So even these subjective unconscious choices by data scientists can exacerbate the risk of bias as well. And then the next steps are modeling, which is for a lot of data scientists, machine learning folks, like the fun part. But we shouldn't forget that, I mean, it's just one part of the big life cycle, right? And so in the modeling phase, our group created this open source toolkit called AI Fairness 360, which has several algorithms to help developers mitigate those different biases using statistical methods. And others have created other tools as well. But the important point is just put in the effort and do those bias mitigation things in that modeling step. And then the last two steps in that life cycle are evaluation and then monitoring. So again, make sure that you're not just assessing and doing things only on accuracy, but on fairness, robustness, and so forth. Create fact sheets for the entire sort of process and life cycle, and then keep checking those biases, checking for those biases if they've crept in or not. So it really is, I mean, an entire process. So Rich mentioned the governance. I mean, we really need governance throughout the life cycle to achieve these things. So, yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Kush. And sort of one of the examples that you just raised, about hospital utilization and creating models around that puts a sort of fine point on just how interdisciplinary this sort of expertise companies need in order to create AI systems that are going to be both effective and that are not going to create sort of unintended consequences. Paula, when you're putting together teams for both sort of compliance and oversight purposes, or sort of the product management side, what are some of the skill sets that you're thinking about, and how do you create teams that are going to have the sort of foresight to understand sort of the institutions where data is coming from and how they may color data in a way that could result in biased data sets that could permeate into a system? When you're putting together teams, what are you thinking about? How do you structure them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I'm curious to hear how everyone's thinking about it. The short answer is like, what skill sets? Well, really all of them, you know, I'm not being facetious about it, because you're trying to build a pool of expertise and perspectives that is kind of as comprehensive as it can be, right? So what I would say is on my direct team, it is very interdisciplinary, in terms of, you know, designers, product management, engineering expertise, et cetera. And then also kind of people coming from, I'm an anthropologist by training, I'm a political scientist, someone coming from a religion background. And what I would say too is that we don't just rely on the direct team, right? So I mentioned our council, I mentioned we have a pool of experts that we go to, sometimes specific experts on specific topics, sometimes broad civil society organizations. We work with really importantly, we work with our research team when we're, you know, doing user studies to make sure that we've got a very broad base of perspectives and demographics represented there. And then I think the thing that I would say is, you know, equally as important is just like the broad diversity of the team itself and the internal team at Salesforce. And I think this is, you know, we've been making strides on this. We are far from perfect. It's a big challenge for the entire industry, but it's part and parcel. It's like really hard to solve these problems if the people that are creating the technology can't even imagine the impact on people from other walks of life, right? And so, you know, it's a continual learning curve, and we're always trying new methods to widen that sphere of perspectives that are represented.
Thanks.
Hey, Christian, one thing I'd add to that, I think it's a great point that Paula made, but the other piece of this that's I think plays a role a little bit is just kind of your overall company culture and your, you know, your speak up culture and your sort of hotlines, because you'll see even sometimes you'll get some of this comes through those channels that says, hey, I'm aware that we're doing something over there and this makes me nervous for these reasons. And so it's another way to surface just sort of a different set of perspectives.
Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
Go ahead, Dana.
One place I thought was sort of interesting is, and I'm sure you all have the same experiences with all that. Some of the social unrest has been a lot more focus on that part of the company, and we've created, you know, we have employee networks that are affiliated with different groups, right? Hispanic and Black and et cetera. And one of the things when we were testing out one of the AI features in Photoshop, and one of the Black women on our review board was like, hey, this thing doesn't model hair correctly. The AI did not learn it correctly, and so it's doing the wrong thing for the face that was in the model, which he spotted. And it occurred to us, like, why don't we use the Black Employee Network and just have them test us? Like, we have a whole group of people already affiliated, to your point, Rich, of who are organized and interested and engaged about these issues. And they want our products to, you know, be representative of everyone out there. And we already have these existing channels, and it didn't even occur to us 9 months ago. Like, why don't we just go to them? So that's one of the things we've
yeah. I mean, I think both what Dana and Rich both touched on is the issue of culture is paramount here, and so it's not just about what teams you're building to look at these issues directly. It's about the entire team, right? And it's about the composition of the entire team of the company, but the cultural issue of like, what are the cues that are coming from the top that enable people to feel safe to raise these issues, that enables them to know that they're not to the contrary, they're not only not going to be punished or penalized for raising these issues, but that they're that it's part of their job, right? Because there's no way that one small team is going to spot all of this stuff. And in fact, you want everyone across the company looking out for these stuff and engaging in healthy conversations. So having anonymous channels, non-anonymous channels, like finding all the ways possible to surface these questions is really, really important.
So BSA as an organization are sort of, there's an alphabet soup of tech organizations out there. I think our unique niche in the world is that we represent companies that are mostly sort of enterprise focused companies, B2B software companies. And so the sort of AI challenges in that space are a little bit unique, because at times sort of companies like Workday is a great example. You're oftentimes creating AI tools and services that may include pre-trained AI models that you sort of license access or sell to your customers who will then customize those models or retrain them using their own data. Rich, can you talk a little bit about sort of how that creates complex challenges when it comes to risk management, and sort of how there are, in essence, a shared responsibility between companies like yours that are developing AI and your customers who are customizing or retraining those AI systems before they're deployed?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question. I think it's a hard question. And I think candidly, I think it's the area, at least one of the areas that I feel is like probably the one that needs a lot more work than probably most others. And, we could, Dana mentioned fonts. I mean, there's a lot of technology that we produce that doesn't, rise to the level of being of high risk or highly concerning. It was great to hear on the fireside discussion, the comment by Executive Vice President Vestager about, sort of things that don't touch on fundamental issues should be, I think she said, should be left alone. And so there's a lot of things we do that are in that category. We have capability that allows, when I'm either filing an expense report or reviewing people's expense reports, there's an anomaly detection ML tool that sort of highlights things that look a little different than the norm. And they just say, hey, you should take a closer look at this. So that's one of those things where when we hand that off to a customer, we don't worry too much about that thing going sideways. But there are other things we do related to hiring or compensation or advancement or promotion or skills or things that relate to more fundamental human issues and people's livelihoods that you have to take far more care and spend far more rigor on. And so those we have to look at really closely. We have to test them rigorously. We have to scrutinize them. But we do all that work, and you're right. I mean, you put it out into the real world, into the wild, and a customer then uses it, and they put their own data into it, or maybe they misuse it in some ways, and you've got challenges. So we can do some things. Paula touched on this, I think, in her opening comments of, they have an acceptable use policy at Salesforce, and they say, do not use facial recognition or do not use our models to essentially fire up and empower facial recognition technology. So you can do things contractually to limit the scope. You can give customers lots of information and transparency and clarity about how to use it and where, what it's intended for, and here are those risks. You can give them guidelines. You can give customers guidelines on, hey, here's how you might want to look at this to make sure that you're kind of keeping it trued up, or that it's not drifting, one direction or the other that's problematic. But that's an area where I feel like, gosh, there's tooling that's being developed, but I don't think it's great, and I think it's got a long way to go before it gets better. And there are reasonable reasons that we can't do certain things. Like, our customers don't want us, wandering around in their data to see how these things are performing. So we've got privacy regulations, we've got contractual restrictions. And so this is an area I think is really, really hard. You're right, though. I think there is a shared accountability. And I don't think it would be crazy for any of us to get up here and advocate that, like, once we develop a piece of technology and we hand it out to a customer, our job is now done, our responsibility is no more. That won't fly. And so we're going to have to figure out what is that shared accountability and how that plays out.
As a customer of Workday, I'm excited to hear all of the rigor you're putting into this. But it is interesting. I'm going to follow up on what you had said in your opening remarks, Rich, which was the value of having a regulation or legislation that we believe in that gives people comfort. Because as a customer of Workday or other enterprise customers, enterprise sales tools, you're nervous about taking them on, right? You're nervous about the AI features that are in there because you're worried. You're worried that, well, I don't know what this is going to do, and can I just flip the switch and turn it on? And did they do their job, and did they test it, or did they not test it? And I'm the one who gets the lawsuit. And if Rich did a good job in his contract that he was just advocating for, maybe I don't have a recourse to Workday, and I got to take on that lawsuit myself. And so then maybe I don't use it at all, is my point. What would be better is this framework or is legislation or regulation that we can point to, and then Rich can say, hey, look, I complied with that, and this is the standard, or there's a standard, and we complied with that. And we've been an advocate for having an approach that was more about test data sets and testing the outcome, understanding how the AI does against a standard data set, that so you can understand the results and say, hey, look, as long as I'm testing against this thing that NIST or somebody else has created and I'm getting these kinds of results, that means I'm in this normal range. That actually makes me feel better if someone has that ability to show that. And then I can say, all right, well, at least when I test this thing, if they're in that normal range, I can use it. And if they're out of the normal range, then in my contract, I can go after Rich and say, this was defective in accordance with this practice. So I think it follows up from your first point nicely, Rich.
Yeah, no, I 100% agree, Dana.
Yeah, and one thing I'll add.
You get that in writing, by the way.
We'll talk later.
One thing I wanted to add to Rich's point and to Christian's question is, I mean, in some ways, the retraining that happens or the customization that happens on the customer side is part of the longer life cycle as well, right? So it's not like it isn't even just kind of part of the big picture. And in earlier parts also of this life cycle, there are points of taking stuff that already exists elsewhere, customizing, retraining, and then passing it on. So on our side, when we're thinking about the tooling for AI governance and so forth, we are starting to think in that mode where any sort of process by whichever entity is involved should be kind of documented and captured and kind of treated in the same way. So if our mindset is that anything from the very beginning to the very end use is all part of one life cycle, I think we can start making some progress.
Great. And, this conversation is, of course, happening against the backdrop of the European Union's recent, or European Commission, rather's recent introduction of a proposed AI regulation. So question for all of you, for Dana, I know this is something that you've been looking at a lot yourself. In light of that AI regulation, can you talk a little bit about why you think impact assessments are going to be so critical and sort of how they might offer a path towards global alignment on the AI policy?
Yeah, absolutely. And we were very pleased with the draft proposal from the EU. We liked where it was going. And I know that was a lot of hard work by people on this call and BSA itself and sort of informing the government about the positive benefits of AI. And again, I think Rich alluded to earlier, which is, there can be a knee-jerk reaction to say, because of these biases, AI is bad and we should just, squash the effort. And that would be the worst case scenario, right? This is, in our tools, you can use AI to make something that used to take 6 months in 6 minutes. And that's great for our creative professionals, right? That makes them more efficient, makes them more productive, more money in their pocket, right? So AI is a positive thing for most of the people who use it. And so we're pleased to see that the way they looked at the regulation, looked at high risk and low risk, that is an innovation encouraging way of approaching it. The other key piece that you mentioned on the impact assessment, we've talked a little bit about it, but the reason we think that's a good idea, a good approach is, first of all, GDPR is very prevalent. And GDPR required everyone to do privacy impact assessments, and impact assessments are prevalent in environmental law, where you have to do an environmental impact assessment. So the concept of doing an impact assessment is already in everyone's mind, and the engineering teams in Adobe already have to do privacy impact assessments. And so, not a hard lift to say, well, there's another step. No one likes doing another step, but at least it's a step they're somewhat familiar with. And when you think about global proliferation, right, again, there's been this conditioning around the concept that we have to assess, what we're about to do, maybe to Paula's point about the consequences, which is what these impact assessments do, and then decide what we're going to do with this next step as an engineering team. So that concept's already out there. Much of the world has adopted GDPR. I mean, given that the prevalence of that and the leadership they took there in the privacy realm. And so we feel good about that. And then we love the part about the impact, in the part of the impact assessment, as I mentioned before, is this off-ramp, right? How do we get most of our team shipping products as fast as possible? And you can design that impact assessment in a way to help them understand what that risk is and say, look, this is not us. And then the ones that are hard, then they have to come in, do this full presentation to the board, explain everything they did. And that's more rare, but it's valuable. We just did one a couple of weeks ago on fraud. Our business team was trying to reduce the amount of fraud that we're getting, credit card fraud that's coming into our company. And the fraud AI that we use, was designed to appeared to be non-discriminatory, but they would just look country of origin and names, and they would stay away from zip codes and everything else. But when they showed it to us, we're just like, well, did you test this? Because AI generalizes information from this, and you could learn something from a pattern of last names or a particular country of origin into a place that is not appropriate. And they hadn't tested it, and this was an internal product, and we're like, go test it. Go get these data sets and go test it. But it came out from the impact assessment in a way that we realized what they had done, what they hadn't done. So we were able to efficiently point them back to the road and have them try again. But it was an important feature for Adobe. We get a lot of credit card fraud, and we lose millions of dollars every year because of it. So it's something to keep working at and get right and do it right. But it saves us money. It stops criminals. And so again, the AI feature itself isn't bad. It's good. We just have to do it the right way.
Yeah. And I think there are actually a lot of interesting parallels between the conversations we're having now on AI and the conversations that were happening around privacy in the years leading up to the GDPR. One of the things that we've talked about today is sort of how there's within the AI space this distinction between AI developers and the companies that are deploying the AI systems. I think there are a lot of parallels between sort of the data processor roles and the data controller roles under the GDPR. And again, sort of speaks to why impact assessments can be such a meaningful way to increase transparency between sort of the multiple stakeholders that are in the AI value chain. Rich, one of the things that is often talked about and is, we're as an organization very focused on is that, the US doesn't have a comprehensive privacy law yet. There's great hope that, Congress will pass something soon. So there's a risk, a concern that, we may be heading in a similar direction with AI, with the EU sort of racing to set what could become the global de facto standard for how AI is regulated. If you were advising the Biden administration, what would you suggest? How would you suggest they engage in Europe domestically to make sure that we don't end up in a place sort of like we did with privacy, where there's a bit of a mismatch between our two systems that has created some, difficulties for enterprise software companies?
Yeah, no, it's difficulties is a good way to describe it. I mean, we're a global company. We have the customers we serve in many respects are global customers, and there's in some ways a huge frustration to see some of these areas where there's just fragmentation and a patchwork quilt of regulation. And it's, I don't think there's probably nothing that will more quickly stymie the benefits of AI than if that's the world we end up living in. But I listened to, at least I caught the first part of the panel discussion or the fireside chat this morning. I was super encouraged by it. I mean, this Technology and Trade Council sounds super promising. The comments from the participants on that, I think, sound like we're heading in the right direction. So at least we're off to a great start. I would, that would be one of my themes, would be do everything we can to create some, level of harmonization where we can between the U.S. and Europe and other democracies and how we think about this technology. And then I would tack on to it. You mentioned GDPR and this sort of the state of affairs where we are today, which is not a bad state of affairs in some ways. I mean, I think we've all sort of adopted the GDPR framework as kind of the high watermark. We're applying it not just for European customers, we're applying it essentially globally. And I think, as we see some of the other regulation coming, it's sort of at least of the same ilk. So that, I mean, that part is good, but I'd say that, the challenge that we've all had is on the data transfer mechanisms between the US and Europe. And it's a different topic, but it's inextricably intertwined with AI, because AI is fueled by data. And so to the extent that we can have responsible, thoughtful, relatively uniform ways that we can transfer data between the US and Europe, I think is a equally important thing for the Biden administration to focus on. And I know they are. I know that they've talked about it, I believe, last week when they were together. But the precursor or the successor to the Privacy Shield is something that we need to get put in place, and that would be super important for the work we're talking about here today.
And what's interesting, maybe like building on that and the point about GDPR, is thinking about the interactions between privacy regulation and potential AI regulation, and making sure that there's a sort of cohesive approach to both. In the sense, one example, in order to test for bias, you need data to test for bias. Some places there is privacy regulation, some places there's not. It's not always clear what data you can use to test for that bias, right? So it's really important that we think about this holistically so that we can make progress on both of these issues simultaneously.
Great point. Great point, Paula.
And Kush, as the sort of resident technologist on the panel, wanted to sort of bring you into the conversation here. It's fair to say that the pace of technology always moves much more quickly than most legal systems, certainly than the US Congress these days on some of these issues. But as policymakers here in the US and around the world are thinking about areas where, regulation could create additional clarity. What do you see as the benefits of sort of, more legal certainty? What would you like to see in an AI regulatory structure?
Yeah, I mean, we all kind of have the sense that the more constraints that you have, that actually leads to better innovation, right? So when we've talked, throughout this panel, things like recourse or AI testing and assessment, or even what a meaningful explanation is, with all of those, the more clarity there can be on what is sought, I think that will spur innovation and will actually be something for us to get excited about as researchers and developers to come up with solutions for.
Great. And I think we just have like a couple minutes left, so I want to give one of those classic panel wrap-up questions. Ask each of you sort of what you think, what makes you most optimistic about where things are headed with AI, and sort of what keeps you up at night. So Dana, why don't you get us started?
Sure. I think probably echoed by everybody else in the panel, I think AI is a transformative technology, right? 10, 15 years from now, we're going to look back at where we are and think about it as like mobile phones were 15 years ago. It's going to be in our pockets, it's going to be everywhere, it's going to be doing things, it's going to let us do things we've never been able to do before. We're already seeing it at Adobe in terms of efficiency, as I mentioned, and then even just new things, being able to create art and music with limited human intervention, allowing a lot more people access to creativity than they ever had before. And it's exciting. And I think the promise and excitement of the technology will drive it forward past some of the bumps in the road that we've talked about in terms of regulation. But I think Paula correctly noted that when we think about privacy as a data minimization effort and AI as a data maximization effort. And that's the goal. That's the journey ahead of us, is how we're going to sort that out in both of those areas. And I think there's work to do.
Anyone else want to jump in?
I can jump in. I think about the combination of human judgment or human creativity and AI, and I just get blown away by the potential. God forbid I or someone in my family gets cancer. The combination of AI that might detect it sooner or come up with a more precise treatment, and a human doctor to apply judgment to that. I just, leaps and bounds get super excited about that. The thing that keeps me up at night is something that was already mentioned, right? Which is, it's impossible to truly take out bias from AI, just like it's impossible to take out bias from human beings completely. And so developing these shared norms about what's most important to go after, how we can, it's not just getting to what's good enough, it's continual improvement and continual shared learning, and having the trust between companies and governments to keep iterating and innovating on that, I think is really important.
Right, thanks.
I have a somewhat less ambitious, probably view on, and I share Paula's view, but I'll be a little more self-interested. What I need more than anything right now is I need time. Time is my most precious commodity that I have the least amount of. So I am super optimistic about the tools that my colleagues on this panel are developing and that we're developing at Workday that are going to give me time back that, on one hand, I can use that time to be more productive and help Workday drive its aspirational goals forward. But I also can use that time to go to my daughter's soccer game or see my son play basketball. And so I'm looking forward to those benefits of AI that I think are very much here today and are going to get nothing but better. On the thing that keeps me up at night, it's more, I worry the most, I think, about and I think my panelists are in the same bucket of, I worry that all of the concern around big tech and all that's happening with big tech, that we're kind of getting lumped into sort of some of these other challenges in technology that don't really apply to us. Like, I don't run a social network at Workday. I don't have an advertising business model at Workday. So some of these things where AI is being used in ways that's truly tough, hard issues that need to be looked at don't apply to me, and I worry that we're going to get swept into this sort of wave of sort of blowback on some of those issues.
Yeah, no, I fully agree with that. And I mean, one other thought for me, just to wrap things up, is I also believe, that AI can be kind of a force for reducing inequalities in the world across the board, but also, with many technologies, that has not kind of worked out. So just kind of thinking about and figuring out how it is that we can make AI more empowering for all people to really benefit would be the way forward.
Great. Well, want to thank you all for taking the time to join us today, and thank Secretary Raimondo and Executive Vice President Vestager for joining us earlier. Again, want to refer people to our AI bias report that we just put out. You can find it at bsa.org/AI. Our hope is that there will be enough interest in the report that we will turn it into a living document of sorts. We'd love to partner with other organizations and figure out, as the technology evolves, how we need to update the framework to reflect any new challenges that might arise. So with that, I'd like to sign off and thank everyone for joining us today.